Malo lele, tala falava, pulavinaka, half a day, and welcome everyone to our program today. My name is Pastor Kitione Tuitupo, and I'm welcoming all of you to our program. Um, as you know, as Pacific Islanders, we always start a meeting with a prayer, thanking God for all the good work and all the good things we have received, and we continue to pray and ask God to bless us, especially all of you who are serving our community and seeking justice for our communities. So I would like to ask you all to join me in a prayer, and I will say it in my mother tongue, which is Tongan. So please let us focus our attention in prayers. Doa mafmafika mau tamai whahewanya a Fiona, mau whawhitai lahi kia te koe i he whata koe ni koe wikoi ofa pia mo tauhia a Fiona. Pia mau hanga tua koe uhi koe ofa a Fiona au tai whiriwhiri mana. Koe ofa a Fiona tala mai ku laku noa. O ki nasi ai ai toko taha katoa pe, i kai lau a mau tuunga, a mau whakangatangata, pe ko whea e whitu ma whao me ai. Ka mau inasi da tau katoa pe i he keresi laku noa a Fiona pa mau whawhita e kia te koe. Mau hangat kia te koe he whiaf koe ni. O ika mau whata mai o tua ke tala noa. Ke ngahi ngā ue e kaulerei, ke ono langa hake ho mau ngahi whamiri, lakanga ke o mau ngahi motu, ai whangi motu o ku paea pa ngai motu o ku sisi, i kai whakatokanga, kai whawhetai atua he kai pūri, tala mai e puna ke kai toha manu, kai teke awhio. Pea pehe o tua, a ho mana tua ki mautoro. Pea maulota te whewhko ni whai tāpe kina, a ki nautoro ko ui ke nau whai a e tātalai whare, pea mohono whakakoloa ki mautoro e whewhko ni. Ai tō taha ko tō ape ku mau kau mai, o ange ha atamai o ku matala, pea mua te ringa o ku whanongo. Ko hui ke mau tāna ki a ngahi koloa lerei, pa mau whoki atu moia, ko mau ngahi kau ngā whanonga, kau mau ngahi whamiri, pa mau ngahi matakari, o ngā ue ao ngā aki ke nau ngahi mo ui. Koe ato pehe mau lotu e whewhin, whai nā pui kina ki mau tolu mo tataki ki mau tolu. Mau kore katoa ngai me anu wafsi su klais ko alo, ka ko mau wha mo ui. Amen. Amen.
Malo Alpito Faisakal Kitione. Thank you so much for honoring us with that blessing. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. For those who I have not had the honor of meeting, my name is Tavai Matalasi Samuelu. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Executive Director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, also known as EPIC. I'm incredibly grateful to Faifika or Pastor Kitione for starting that space because it's really important that I acknowledge and honor that, as is the way in our Pacific Islander custom, wherever you lay your burdens down, whoever you raise your praises to, it's really about a blessing and how you start every space that way as a practice of gratitude, of humility, of acknowledging and honoring everyone who's in the space, everyone who's present, offering them the best of your spirit. I was taught, and as a kid who grew up as a Faifiao's daughter, as a pastor's daughter, that the structure of a prayer is to name all of the names, to enter with grace, that you also ask for forgiveness. So for those who, I may be dishonoring or maybe misstepping and not naming you specifically, I do want to ask that you forgive me at the onset. And I think it's also a great spirit to enter spaces with. So we're all gathered here today for this funder briefing that we are calling, again, with humility, Pacific Islanders leading for an equitable recovery. Now, before we get too deeply into it, Bree, if you could get to the next slide, please. We have a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. So I recognize we are over a year into this pandemic, that many of us may be Zoom veterans, but we do want to offer these friendly and hopefully helpful reminders about how we can keep and share this space together, around making sure that you're muted. We want to encourage you all to please be active and engaged in the chat. We have folks like Chauncey and Lisa Hasagawa who are going to be monitoring the chat, bringing things to my focus as your moderator. Any questions and answers, so we want to encourage you to be in conversation in the chat box. However, any specific questions, if you could please place those in the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your panel. And that we are also recording this. We are recording as a means of sharing this with folks afterwards, especially those who have signed up not to attend, but to receive the recording. If you are uncomfortable being on recording, please, again, because this is a webinar, it means that you will see the panelists, but you as attendees will not be visible. If there are any questions, oppositions, things that you are concerned about, please feel free. Our brilliant Bree is doing the tech background, so you can feel free to either privately or directly message Bree with any questions. Thank you. Next slide. Thanks, Bree. And so, you know, we have some very ambitious and modest goals for our time together. This is a very well-timed, packed 90 minutes that we have together, or however long that you are ready to be with us. So our purpose is really about increasing investment in the Pacific Islander community in the state of California, and these outcomes that we have listed. So I'm not going to read them all out to you. I respect your reading comprehension and know that you can do these things. Next slide, please, Bree. And so this agenda, again, we've already gone through our opening. We have Executive Director of Advancement Project California, John Kim, who's going to provide a contextual framework of this conversation. We'd love and I'm excited that you all will be hearing from Unsuk Lee, who's the director of the AAPI Civic Engagement Fund, who will be talking about, from her perspective, as somebody who's been a longtime supporter of the Pacific Islander community and also acts as a funder, what it means to increase philanthropic investment in our communities. Of course, EPIC would be nothing without our partners, and that we want it to be understood and really championing their work. So you'll be hearing from Auntie Fran Lujan, Patsy Taito, and Lalofi Sokai, who will be sharing their stories about their work. And then, of course, we want to hear from you all. What is it that you hope to learn? And so our question and answer portion, and then we'll be closing things out. We also have Pastor Pasakaya Thompson, who's present to close us with a blessing. Next slide, please. So again, you know, as is our custom, there's so much gratitude to be doled out at this moment. And in particular, we really want to thank our event co-sponsors, many of whom are the ones you probably received an invitation from. They've been ready champions, thought partners, and been really critical to the success of both the planning and the implementation of this webinar. And hopefully, you know, although we're being very ambitious with our time together, we hope it's just the beginning and that we are continuing to foster relationships with each other. So thank you so much. Next slide, please. So again, you have our speakers, and you'll be meeting them in more depth throughout this conversation. Ray, if you want to go to the next slide, please. And then the next slide. Great. So at this time, Bree, you can take the slides down. I really want to turn it over to John Kim, who's the Executive Director of Advancement Project California, and he will be providing context for this conversation.
Afternoon, everyone. An extraordinary turnout for this event, so thank you all for making the time and sharing the space. I'm so grateful for our long-term partnership with EPIC and Tavai. You know, we've been in the trenches together with Tavai and EPIC on so many different efforts, from the census at the statewide level to Bold Vision here in LA County. And I have to just say, on a personal note, the wisdom and perspective that she brings to every space that I've shared with her. The strength she exhibits on behalf of the Pacific Islander community and the racial justice movement overall is truly a sight to see. I'm also honored to get to know and partner with Lisa and NeighborWorks America, so thank you again for co-sponsoring this event. And I just want to give a special shout out to Chauncey Smith, who is our manager of Race Counts Initiative. He's been our lead from the Advancement Project California in this event and has done a wonderful job. So again, let's go ahead and jump right into it. You know, one of the most heartbreaking habits of our country, and even in the most progressive corners of it, is our habit for historic amnesia and systemic erasure. There are too many stories we choose to forget of our colonial past, of brutal overthrows and land grabs, and invisibilizing of cultures and cultural practices. And too often, we too easily erase whole peoples by staying overly narrow in what we measure, whose story we lift up, and who we allow at our decision-making tables. Unfortunately, the Pacific Islander community has been for too long particularly burdened by these heartbreaking habits and practices here in America. For a moment last year, there was a smattering of stories and coverage of the devastating impact of COVID-19 has had specifically on the PI community. But those disparate impacts were not confined to that particular moment in time. They were unfortunately a hallmark of this entire pandemic. Through every search, including the one that we see today, NHPI communities have been the most disproportionately impacted community here in California of COVID cases. And even stepping back farther, walking into the pandemic, statewide data here in California has shown how this community was already so burdened by the oppressive weight of systemic racism. On areas around economic opportunity, the per capita annual income for whites nearly doubled that of NHPI. The uninsured rate for NHPI of whites, and on home ownership, whites had nearly 1.5 times the higher of home ownership rate than NHPI. And you should note here that I'm citing statistics for the NHPI grouping, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, because there's scantly any data on Pacific Islanders specifically and Pacific Islander communities specifically. And so this is where we as a state and as a movement too often fall off. We don't measure what's happening in the state with enough precision, and that's too often led us to invisibilize communities like the Pacific Islander community. And at the same time, when I think about, I've had the honor of partnering with Pacific Islander leaders for throughout my entire career, and a word when I think of these leaders is solidarity. Through so much of my organizing and advocacy campaigns, when I've partnered with Pacific Islander leaders, I've been in awe of how quickly and comfortably they are able to show up and stand in solidarity with other people of color in the fight. They stand against anti-Blackness that pervades all of our communities. They stand against xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment that we all grew up with here in California. And they stand with other Indigenous communities for generations. And my question now is how we, as a larger racial justice movement, stand up more in solidarity with them. How do we stand with them as they stood with us, not just as a matter of reciprocity, but as a matter of following their model on what solidarity looks like? For me personally, I'm often labeled as a API leader. That's the label that I've been given often, as an Asian Pacific Islander label. And that means that I have to hold sometimes this contradiction that whereas to honor the solidarity across the East Asian, Asian American, South Asian, and Pacific Islander diaspora, and to hold that solidarity, but also to be careful to not let the larger umbrella of who we are further invisibilize the component parts like the Pacific Islander community. Here again, when you look at some of the data, you can look closely at the traditional poverty measures in California. You'll find that, 12% of Asian Americans API are in poverty. But when you break that down even farther, comparing that to 17% for NHPI. And when I talked about the COVID cases, unfortunately, NHPI throughout all of the pandemic has been the worst off in COVID cases, while Asian Americans have actually been the best off on COVID cases for most of this pandemic. So how do we as a movement do better to build bridges and build power together, but not to inadvertently harm or submerge any one of us? In the end, for me, and I know for many of you all, this is about power. And when I think of the PI leaders that I've worked with in the past and the many that you'll hear from today, you can already see the personal power that they bring into these spaces. But the question now is, how do we support them so they gain more mass political power? As we've all seen, data is power. Storytelling is power. And a key outcome for our convening today is so that we can build up the data and storytelling capacity of this community. Building off the legacy of reports done by EPIC and Asian Americans Advancing Justice in 2014, our hope is to spark a new conversation with a PI-specific report next year. But beyond data and storytelling, we need to also be clear that independent organizational capacity is also power. So I believe that we as organizational partners, as funders, have to do all we can to support and nurture independent political power for the Pacific Islander community and increasing our commitments and support for PI-led organizations that many of you will see in this webinar and across the state, and to help us lift up more PI leaders in our conversations and our decision-making tables. So thank you again for taking the time and sharing the space with us. And now I believe I have the honor of handing things over to Unsuk, who will take it from here.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, and thank you, John. Thank you also to the organizers, and especially to Tavai for inviting me to be a part of this event. So our fund, the Asian American Pacific Islander Civic Engagement Fund, was established in 2014 to address the historic underfunding of Asian American and Pacific Islander groups in the civic engagement sector. Since our inception, we've made over 18 million in grants. When we started the fund, we discussed at length the naming of the fund. Will it be PI and AA or not? We know that every organization within our community has, made a conscious effort to ensure, to the degree that they can, that they're representative. And we decided that it would be AAPI because we had the goal of doing what we can to meet the needs and gaps in both communities. But we also understood that adding PI included a responsibility and it couldn't just be aspirational. In the years that we've been funding the API community, we've learned that a unique strategy is important, a strategy that takes into account the AAPI context. For other civic engagement funders, oftentimes they can say, oh, we've got a state strategy, we've got a focus on relational organizing, or we're looking at voting rights. But when it comes to funding the API community, it's all of it. It's about grassroots organizing and leadership development, crossover alliances, building organizational infrastructure, reclaiming narratives, and culturally informed and relevant data and research. We've found it difficult to prioritize one over the other because all components are needed in the community, and oftentimes there are a few other opportunities for resources and support in the AA and PI community. So frankly, our most significant challenging goal is to support an ecosystem of grounded community-led civic engagement organizations so that PIs and Asian Americans can become a powerful and influential electorate. There's often been said that the API community is complex and maybe not organizable. We say it is, but in order to do that and to develop that level of strategic unity, what is necessary is to recognize that there are multiple ethnicities and languages that make up the community, and it's not complicated and confusing. It's actually an asset if we can understand it and ensure that we do what we can to take account for racial hierarchy and make sure that that is addressed. So what I want to share sort of is our own sort of practical experience of how we've tried to address this. One is from the very beginning, we've been tracking the constituencies that are represented by the groups that we fund. Many of our groups, as you know, oftentimes use an umbrella, but what's important is also specifics. Are we really Pan-Asian, or are you specifically working with the South Asian community or the East Asian community, what have you? And in looking at the representation, it allowed us to set goals for addressing the imbalance of resources and power within the AAPI community. We made a decision to allocate greater funding to communities with greater needs and less infrastructure. That includes the PI community, the Southeast Asian community, or Muslim American community. We've hosted conversations with grantees on issues about historical differences within API communities, issues of colorism, how to understand and address racial equity and intersectionality, both in practice and in collaboration, and how that gets reflected in real policy making and research. And specifically also with the NHPI community, we've been forthright about where we're lacking, and we've been proactive about seeking out more NHPI groups to support. We've particularly partnered with Tavai, who John already said it, but is a tremendous asset to the community. For example, EPIC and Tavai worked with us on hosting a webinar for our grantees specifically about NHPIs. And in all the projects that we've taken on, we've reached out to EPIC to ensure that there is PI representation, for example, in the publication for Ahead of the Majority report. And most recently, when we developed the Movement Hub, in terms of developing the demographic data, consulting with EPIC and Tavai about the best way to represent the Asian American community versus the PI community. And I think it's also important to point out that we don't just reach out to Tavai as a PI leader, but because of her expertise as a feminist, as a young API leader, I benefit tremendously from the knowledge that she has that I do not have in that field. And about 1.5 years ago, however, it was clear to us that we still were not doing enough. And we reached out to Tavai to talk more about the landscape and determine the more proactive role that we can play in establishing durable organizations and leaders. We know that EPIC and their partners will lead the charge, and that resources alone do not produce the change we seek. But it is about offering the right type of resources and the other forms of support. So as I said, we haven't figured it out completely, but our approach is to be there to listen, to identify ways that we can be of support from the sidelines. And we just know that for us at the fund, our responsibility is to open doors and share what we know and what we have. So we're all here today to directly hear from the PI leaders. And it is going to be essential that we have disaggregated data combined with insights from community leaders and organizations that are aligned and supported to take action with that data. I hope we can work together to strengthen support for PI leaders and organizations over the long term for both the future of and an equitable and inclusive California. So with that, thank you very much. And I'm not sure who I hand it back to.
Thank you so much, Unsuk, for sharing all of those words, for the kindness of what you've said. I also want to thank John for his remarks. I think what they both illustrate, and really kindly and beautifully, are the ways that meaningful and authentic inclusion of Pacific Islanders is a critical tool and necessary step for actual racial equity and justice. So thank you all. And you all have been incredibly kind in naming my leadership specifically. And I want to say really sort of openly and with the utmost humility that I'm nothing without the elders who've laid the ground for us. Something that John had also noted, right, in talking about data, how often data can be weaponized to tell our communities that we're not large enough, that we're not statistically significant. The other ways that data is used to frame us as deficit as opposed to asset. And so this panel that we have, this discussion that I'm excited for you all to meet if you haven't already. If Auntie Fran, you could turn your camera on, as well as Patsy and Nalofi, and join me on this virtual stage as we embark on this discussion. This other piece that, it was always important, especially coming into EPIC about 4 years ago, recognizing that we didn't have the same infrastructure as other communities, that many of the organizations who had founded us were no longer active, and that the role and critical importance of it doesn't matter if Epic is strong if everybody else isn't strong with us. That what we're responsible for is the entire canoe, the entire village. And so who we have featured here today are also noting that forever, since time immemorial, Pacific Islanders have understood that stories are data. And even when there are gaps in how folks seek to measure or quantify our suffering, that we have so many stories. And I've brought and I'm glad to introduce or share with you all and share this virtual stage with some brilliant storytellers. So I want to start giving each of you a little bit of time to introduce yourselves, answer that Pacific Islander question of who is your name. So we'll start with Auntie Fran, and then we'll go to Patsy and then Lolofi. Auntie Fran?
Half a day. I am Auntie Fran. It is the ultimate job title beyond museum director and curator. I am a Indigenous Chamorro woman from the island of Guam, which we call Guahan, which means we have. I am the caretaker and guardian of the ancestor pieces that are temporarily residing at the Pacific Island Museum, which is in Long Beach. But we are guests of the Tongva people, and I'm extremely grateful and thankful for them for receiving us and receiving me. Our space, museum is such a weird word, such a colonizer word. We are a community house, and this space is to illuminate these of our Pacific Islander cultural practitioners and artists in their presence and practice. Sanamasi.
Thank you, Auntie Fran. Patsy?
Talofa Patsy Tito, Executive Director here at the Samoan Community Development Center in San Francisco. SCDC has been around for the last 30 years, and it was laid down from our elders those 30 years ago, and we're still standing on their shoulders. So glad to be here. It's a humbling space, and I look forward to the conversation that's going to continue in this space.
Whakataitele lava, Patsy. Lolofi?
Malo Lele. My organization is Malo. Malo means thank you in the Tongan language. We serve under the acronym Motivating Action, Leadership Opportunity, a Pacific Islander-led organization. My name is Alofi Soakai, founder and executive director. Malo is the only Tongan-led nonprofit in the Inland Empire that work along the side of the Tongan community. We not only preserve Tongan culture, but we also advocate on behalf of the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, and we are fighting for inclusion, awareness, and connecting of resources. For a capstone project of mine, I was asked what kind of positive change I wanted to see in this world. Automatically, it was my Pacific Islander community that came to mind. The Tongan community has been in the city of Ontario since the 1970s, but yet we are still in the shadows, underserved, underrepresented, and under-resourced. So the thought of being included, represented, and finding ways to build up community helped Malo come to life. Malo serves intergenerationally in a way where your kids become our kids, and our elders are valued and their stories and teachings are honored in ways to help preserve culture. We are reminded by the pandemic that Malo must continue this work, and there's so much work to be done. Malo is proud to be the first Tongan community-based organization in the Inland Empire to outreach for the 2020 census. And we are very proud that we have a annual backpack distribution that we give 300 backpacks out to the Tongan community, where we send our kids off to school confident and ready to learn. Our COVID response efforts have included food distribution, weekly food distribution, monthly PPE distribution, and we helped to lead 5 Pacific Islander COVID testing sites with over 400 participants, and at these sites we included Pacific Islander translation. Now we have moved on to our vaccine outreach, and we are we are hard at work, definitely to say that. Today, we seek funding that aligns with our mission, looking to build relationships with our funders for long-lasting partnerships. We have a long-term goal of one day having a Pacific Islander Resource Center in the Inland Empire. And at this time, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for getting to know more about Malo, and that we continue to fight for positive change during a pandemic and throughout the years. Malo.
Thank you so much to each of you for that introduction, albeit I know only a modicum of all the amazing things that you all do. So, throughout it, a lot of what EPIC has been working in, a lot of our advocacy has spoken about numbers and data and the high rates and sort of the case rate per 100,000, all of these things that are important in illustrating the point. But I think you all on the ground have really critical stories to share about the impact of COVID-19. So I'd love to start with you, Auntie Fran. What was the impact of COVID-19 on PIAM, as well as the community that you all serve?
Thank you, Tavai. As an arts organization, the effect of COVID, we were among the first to temporarily close, and we were among the last to reopen, because clearly no one sees arts as important. So for our community, how it has affected us is that this space has served not just as an art space, but a space of sharing stories and knowledge. And even with EPIC, we also did a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander census convening, and then the art supported those questions. We also did something untraditional in terms of creating an exhibit that was about birthing, and it was led by a midwife and doula. And that's what the pandemic did, is like, we can't do that. We can't address that experience. And then the artists, who are phenomenal, and we have them, they are here. They are very much present in everywhere, but in Southern California is quite a phenomenal group of, some of them are already famous because they're on the CBS Morning News. Shout out to JP Pereira, Jason Pereira, who's just out there. So that's what, the pandemic had, didn't afford us, but we did also create something quite magnificent. During this global pause, it allowed us to do a programming called Pacifica Transmission, if you haven't seen it. And it allowed our artists to have access to our ancestor pieces. And when I say access, it is total, as everybody's saying, decolonize, because we don't do that here. Clearly, I'm Chamorro. But they were able to meet an ancestor piece and be mindful and spend time. They only have 2 rules, is to ask permission, and do all of you know how to use a broom, because I'm a staff of 1, basically. But when they asked permission, they got to meet a sail from Puluwat, and the sail, when they saw that, and they said, do you miss the sun? So guess where the sail went? Outside. Do you miss the sun? Do you miss the wind? It misses our community. So this is, what happened. That was the plus only during that time, because we gave these artists this magnificent time for them to be actually, brilliant at what they do.
Thank you so much for that, Auntie Friend. I also just want to make sure we lift up as well, how critical your space is in helping people to feel safe again, to feel whole again. How much of a role you've played in healing, and in particular, when we've struggled to translate the wonkiness of policy or COVID best practices or CDC messaging that can seem to change so quickly, that it's our artists who live and find their homes at PIAM that we turn to make these messages accessible, to make them translated to our culture. So thank you. Patsy, if you could share what has been the impact of COVID, because I know you all have played a critical role in serving the community during this time.
Well, thank you, Tavai. Yeah, since March 16, 2020, SCDC still has been on the ground providing care packages for our community, and we never stopped. We had to turn in our in-person programs to virtual programs, making deliveries, and it got to a point where the data was starting to come out with high COVID, testing positive for COVID. And so we had to go do some advocacy from the city to the city of San Francisco. And so we were able to get like testing sites at SCDC so that our community could feel comfortable, supported, that, seeing someone brown who talks like them, looks like them, that they'll be comfortable to be part of, to get tested. And so, a lot of our folks lost, because a lot of our folks are essential workers. And so some still work, some lost their jobs. So we had to find ways to support them in any way we could. And so we just kept, there's a bunch of us, there's a lot of advocacy around the Pacific Islander Samoan community here in San Francisco. And so we were able to get the city and county to really support our community in these different avenues of just making sure we can provide for our community so that, no one is, no family is left behind, no family is starving, they have the essential needs. And especially around our seniors, we wanted to make sure they were taken care of because they're the ones that were the vulnerable population at the time. And so we did, wellness checks. We did all kinds of things to make sure our community was able to get the same resources everyone else was getting. So it was, so we've been on the ground since March 16th, and we never stopped. It was never a day where we said, all right, let's take a break. When the city shut down, SCDC kept standing, kept on moving, and we're still moving. So yeah, just a little tired, but we're like the wind, we just keep it moving. And so and like you said earlier, God puts us in a place where we continue to rely on Him, and then we just listen to where He guides our direction and our path. So yeah, so we've been okay, we've been good, but we still have a long way to go.
Thank you, Patsy. There's so much of what you all do I respect and admire and sort of aspire to be in that way. And it also reminds me a lot, SCDC, for me feels akin to the survival programs of the Black Panther Party and all of the ways that you actually help our communities to survive. From the language classes, I love what Auntie John is doing on Facebook if folks want to tune in. If you ever want to learn Samoan language, songs, or dancing, you definitely need to watch SCDC's Facebook page. But the other piece of you get folks counted and tested and vaccinated and employed and fed. So I think it can't be understated the role that you all play in that very specific space. So thank you. Lolofi, what about you? What has been the impact of COVID on Malo and the communities that you all serve?
Sorry, very, very similar to Patsy, just, a organization that was, made to preserve culture, ending up being at the front line at everyone's door, doing contactless drop-offs. And then when there was food resources out there, we had to think quickly. How do we support the families in their day-to-day with returning to school? So quickly we put together, with the love and blessings of so many nonprofits in the local area too, we were able to put together 300 backpacks distributed, as well as care packages. And for a community who doesn't really know what a care package is, we got to actually see when we would hand them a package and they ask, what is this? And we say, it's a care package. And they're like, what is a care package? It's just saying we care. And then, you know, it's just some masks, some hand sanitizer. And it was like, you know, in that moment, we're like, we're just introducing new things to our community that they should have had like long ago, you know. So we've been learning a lot as an organization, and we've just been understanding more about how, again, we have so much work to do, and that I'm just very, very blessed to be in this space right here, to be able to just share that, you know, in a moment of pandemic, we have learned, you know, how to stand together in community, not just with our NHBI families and communities, but with all the local organizations and funders just coming together to actually hear our voices. So yeah, the pandemic has just helped our families understand that they are not alone in anything. That like our Tongan communities, there's no one that's homeless ever. Like, you're going to someone's house. That's just not a thing that happens. And it was just a reminder to some of our folks that you know, when there's just too much love in our communities, that we don't let anybody fall no matter what's going on. So pandemic just really helped show that, you know, we're at these doors, you know, at that moment without our kids, but right now we have our kids who are literally working alongside us. So it's just really amazing to see that we are also building these young leaders that are really finding their place into service. So just I'm just very blessed by not the pandemic, just blessed by the way that we're able to see what our power is in you know, having a mindset where we don't have much confidence to have a voice, and then the pandemic has really brought us to a place where we're stepping up and saying, please, you have to hear us. You have to hear us. There's data showing you have to hear us now.
Thank you for that, Lalafi, and a lot of, you know, commending to you, because my law started about 3 years ago. So the pandemic was this ultimate test, and I saw you pivot so quickly in this incredibly grassroots family affairs. You talk about it, like you and your, you know, your 8 to 12 siblings, they're all the ones who are at the doors and dropping off and showing. I think I also want to lift up, right, as you're talking about the care packages, we also know that you all are the ones, right, that they may not go to or believe a nurse or a doctor, but they'll call you and ask, right, that you become not just frontline in that, but like when they need something, they come to you all, that you have become the solution that they seek out. So thank you for that. Now, I'd be remiss, right, because, you know, this is a funder briefing. I also want to note that our communities, that you all as leaders, we didn't have any distance from the impact of COVID-19, right? That it wasn't simply about looking at numbers and data, that we ourselves, I can say personally, like my entire household got COVID in August. That many of the folks that we work with also got COVID. We saw many, right? We didn't need to see the mortality rates. We saw the funerals that we were going to or being asked to contribute to on a weekly basis. So in that, I want to understand and hear from you all, what were the gaps, right? That you filled in where equity wasn't present, but what were the gaps and how can philanthropy help to fill those gaps? So we'll start with Auntie Fran, then we'll go to Patsy and then Lolofi.
I'm going to quote someone who's not an islander, just to fill in the gap. Albert Einstein, get this, you know, give it to a mathematician, who said, all religion, arts, and sciences are branches of the same tree, because they serve the same larger purpose, to uplift the lives of human beings. So this is not a new idea. So the principle that Einstein expressed obviously has its roots in the Renaissance, in the Enlightenment, but more so in Pacific Islander indigenous practice, that our process medicine has always been an art and a science. So philanthropy needs to see us as medicine and not as leisure. So where we filled in the gap here at PIAM is we became the medicine to our artists and to the community and in our neighborhood. We created beautiful pieces of artwork that are actually on our fences, not facing inside, but actually on the fences facing the street into a park that says, we got you. We are part of this neighborhood. If you don't want to come in, it's okay. We know what that feels like. We see you, we accept you, We ask you only to offer us permission. And we are part of that medicine. And we tied medicine ribbons around our tree and our fences and gave them empowering messages that were specifically Pacific Islander proverbs, as the ocean is in us. And that's the gap that we filled in, is saying, we can still show you something so magnificent, beautiful. And if you decide to take one of those art pieces, it's okay with us. Then maybe you needed it as shelter. Maybe you wanted a beautiful piece, you know, because we are in this undocumented, you know, we're in a very strange location in here in Long Beach, and we understand our community because we're that community, part of the, you know, part of this marginalized people. But that's such a word that I don't like to lift up to, right? We are empowered, and we got you.
Thank you, Auntie Fran. What about you, Patsy? Where do you see are the gaps, and how can philanthropy help?
I think Auntie Fran took my little saying of, you know, well, like what you were saying, medicine. We were each other's medicines in the time of this pandemic, but as we can kind of continue to process it all. You know, one of the needs were, you know, the our youth. Our youth needed a place to kind of, you know, they were out of school for 6 months, and you know, we were trying to figure out where the needs are from our seniors to our families to our young adults, and then came our youth that we had to figure out how can we engage these young people into you know, because they're used to going to school, going into summer programming. And one of the things we didn't do last year was we had to pivot our in-person programs um, to virtual. And that for the last 20, 24, 25 years of doing summer program, we've always had over 200 plus kids in our summer program, instilling the Samoan culture through music, dance, and language. So we had to figure out what we had to do. And so we, you know, again, we went to virtual, and then we were able to uh, start a community learning hub that was done here in San Francisco through different nonprofits. And we were able to provide the space for our young people to come and do their homework and just be kids and be around their peers. And so that was the need. And you know, I think what Auntie Fran was saying too is like people, you know, whether it be philanthropists or just people in general, need to see us as people and not just the color of our skin. And so the needs was just to make sure like we were able to be seen and that we were going to be each other's medicine during this whole time. And you know, we're still each other's medicine through art, through music, through language, and then even now with our in-person summer program, you know, we were able to get there's a little over 100 kids in our summer program in person from 5 all the way to 18. So there you go.
Thank you. Lofi, what about you? Where do you see the gaps, and how can philanthropy help?
So just know I'm new to this game, so it's been a learning experience. So I will tell you what I learned on the ground. What I learned was the support of unrestricted funds would be really great, because I do my weekly deliveries in a Prius, and I would love if that was something that I could possibly have an option, you know, like if unrestricted funds could possibly get Malo a van to either, you know, take people to their appointments or get food delivered to households where I don't have to make so many runs, that would be amazing. The other thing is I witnessed the undocumented funding come through the Inland Empire. And yes, it went to some powerhouse organizations, but it did not see our communities. I had, you know, myself and my cousin Asena, we had to take the call first because we're not going to give the resource out until we know exactly, you know, what they're in for. And as undocumented community members, they're already scared to make the call to try to ask for this $500 card that's being, you know, there's so much money going out there. So we tried to take the call and we couldn't even get through. So my ask is, you know, how do the philanthropy folks, and how do we do this where there is funding that's allocated to the Pacific Islander communities? Because obviously we witnessed it firsthand. It was not accessible to all. And so that was a learning experience straight out when the pandemic hit, and you know, all of a sudden there's flyers going out, there's so much money for our undocumented communities. You know, we tested it out first, and there was no way we were going to have our communities, you know, be scared and then try to sit on those lines, and then just to find out that, you know, it wasn't even there, it wasn't there for them, you know, it wasn't there for them to begin with. So yeah, I will say that Advancing Justice, they did hear us, because we had asked, can you bring a community member in and let's see if they can. So basically, you know, it was my sister who ended up being there, but she was able to speak the language, get folks on the phone, and I know that at least 25 to 30 people got that $500 card in LA. But as for the IE, it just, unfortunately, I know that it was amazing organizations that got these funds, but it just was not accessible to all.
Thank you for sharing that, Lolofi. I think there are a lot of things that were lifted up, but I think that's a good segue into a question I have specifically for you, right? And so, you know, many of us really favor a population-based approach. And, you know, as somebody who is in the Inland Empire, it's not often understood as a hub for Pacific Islanders. So could you talk more about what does the Pacific Islander community in the Inland Empire look like, and what do they need?
So in the Inland Empire, it is a community that just walks around in the shadows. I'll just say that. You know, we're not really recognized. We're just people that are here that people know of as Pacific Islanders. They know that there's a Tongan, they know that there's a Samoan, but they know nothing more than that. So our organization in the beginning, we were trying to bridge that. We were trying to say, come and learn more about us. Come and learn more about us, counselors. Come and learn more about us, police officers, city council folks, whoever. You know, we even got lucky. A principal came and even spoke because they were just so empowered by the kids sharing with them. I want you to know this about me, you know, so that right there. But, you know, just in the region right now, yeah, it's just, we're working on it. It's getting better. I will say that, you know, we're doing a lot of work in Riverside County, and I'm just going to praise them. There's just a lot of amazing funders out that way that are just really hearing us. And I'm very proud of being a part of that. And I know that, you know, San Bernardino County will make its way there as well, but we're working our way, and, you know, hopefully they don't get mad at me for saying that, but, you know, we're at a time where we have to say these type of things so that people can change some things, you know. So so for me, just, you know, with the Tongan community, we're, you know, going back to, like, you know, we're in the shadows. The people are looking to each other, which all Pacific Islanders, I'm sure a lot of other groups, they know, like, they look to one another for, like, holistic healing because they don't know how to get the health access. They look for, you know, something so simple as a twisted ankle. They don't even know, you know, what paper to fill out to even get your kid's ankle looked at, you know. And I say that because that's something I saw a lot growing up, and I still see now. And for now, like, I'm just, what I envision for the future is just a lot of these, I just see that more access to all of these resources that many communities get that we forever had just never gotten in our homes. So my hope for Malo is we become that bridge. We become that bridge to finally, you know, there's just some disaster relief pamphlets that they were handing out, and I was like, if you give it to me, I will get it to the people. And what happened? They got it to me, and then now, especially with our backpack distribution we just had, every single family that did the drive-through, they all left with a disaster relief ready plan, and we told them, go through this together as a family, everybody get on the same page, put it up in your refrigerator. So that right there, you know, those are the type of ways that I envision that Malo can help to bridge gaps in the Inland Empire, or just period, because we have access to social media. And so we've got people that view our stuff from New Zealand. When we used to have our Zoom calls, we had people that were in our Zoom call meeting our kids from Utah, from from New Zealand. Yeah, it was pretty cool to take advantage of the social media world. But definitely the vision is just to finally have this place where our kids have this social cultural confidence, where they don't have to hide anything about themselves ever, and that they understand that the cultural piece of them is so amazing. That's the reason why some of our athletes are asked, do not help that football player off the field, and you have to tell them, no, that's called good sportsmanship, please, that's a cultural thing, please just let them do that, you know. And just being voices that continue to share like that, and so that the kids can see it's okay to not hide anything about yourself. Yes, we care hard, we love hard, we get mad hard, but we still respect and love, and we are forgiving people because of our faith. So yeah, but just overall the vision for Malo is we will be a resource center in the Inland Empire that will serve our people and be able to share, like Auntie Fran is able to share artifacts that hide in the homes, but we can bring it out to the people to see.
Thank you so much for that, Lalofi. And I've definitely seen the way that you play both systems navigator for the Tongan community and the broader Pacific Islander community, and also as cultural translator, as you explain to PIs why disaster preparedness is important, and then also explain to, you know, the public health department how they should be speaking to your community. So thank you. Patsy, I'd love to ask you, you know, 30 years is nothing to sneeze at. That is a long time that SCDC has been around and been in this game. And I'd love to hear from you, especially because I shared at the onset how many Pacific Islander organizations are no longer here, you know, are no longer active. So for you, you know, what has sustained SCDC?
God being the center of who we are, but sustaining the relationships in the community, with our community, with funders, from the city government to the private funding, the private sector, and it was just building those relationships and not burning any bridges. So, you know, I've been at SCDC for 25 years, so I just gave you guys my age. But in those 25 years, I was able to build relationships over the years, had to learn, navigate the system. Not so, you know, you have to have tough skin in the game. But if you are stay rooted and grounded in who you are and your values of what the mission and the vision is of your organization, then things start to become fruitful. And, you know, it comes to the vision just comes to play to where everything we've asked for, even from starting from with nothing, you know, doing, you know, for the first 5 years of SCDC, there were folks those that came before me, volunteered, had to get things on the ground, had to get the space that we're in. They did all of that work. They laid that foundation, they laid the ground. And then from there, we just kept on building. And, you know, you try to take 2 steps forward and, you know, folks push you back 10 steps back. But with resilience and preservation and prayer kept us moving, kept us going. And, you know, from working with nothing to having something, and still we're still advocating so that we can have equity, we can have parity within who we are. And, you know, as Brown, you know, we're all labeled these different labels and identities, but as Brown people, as we want to make sure that we are equal to all of those other ethnic groups or other folks that are getting, you know, their piece of the pie. We don't want the crumbs anymore. We want to we want the whole pie. But I think one of the biggest things for SCDC and for myself was to build relationships. And, you know, just like I think I met Lisa like, I don't know, 20 some odd years ago, right? And so those are the relationships that I talk about, you know, being able to continue those conversations, and and just making sure that we don't burn any bridges. You have the radical side, and then you have those folks that are very humble in what we're able to get. But there are those times where silence is not an option anymore for us. We just gotta keep on being who we are, stay rooted and grounded in our values, and hopefully we will, SCDC will continue to serve our community. And one of the proverbs we live, we're grounded and rooted in, is Oleala Lepule Ole Totua. The path to leadership is to serve, and we're servants of our community, we're servants of our people, and we're servants of what God's will is for us in this lifetime.
Thank you, Patsy. I love that proverb, and I think you're such an incredible manifestation and example of it, right? I think I especially love that proverb because it also says you can't be a leader unless you serve. We don't have leaders who sit back and relax. All of our folks, they work. And that title of leader is really only bestowed upon you by your community. You don't call yourself a leader. Other people will tell you when you're ready. So thank you so much. Auntie Fran, as I think you've really already spoken to this a bit, right, about the ways that PIAM has really preserved arts and culture for the long term, and especially during this pandemic. I know there's a video that you wanted to share with us. As Bree is getting that queued up, do you want to talk a little bit about this video?
Oh, absolutely. So the video you're about to see, one of our artists who participate in Pacifica transmission, Alawea Moni Pili, who's actually a talking chief, I think one of the youngest ones we've ever known. He's presenting a piece that honors the Pahu that is temporarily at PIAM. And you will see his experience in uncovering the legacy of this particular Pahu. It is with great honor that we watch Alawea.
Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono. The spirit of the land is perpetuated with righteousness. Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono. Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono. Ua mau
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Auntie Fran. Always so healing to be able to hear Moni sing. Such a beautiful voice, but also just as some of you may have seen as Auntie Fran and Moni were putting their fingers up in a triangle. This is a symbol for Mauna Kea or Kukiai Mauna. For those who are currently continue to work to protect Mauna Kea specifically, and in general, to protect the land, as that is our job as Indigenous people, to be good stewards, even as we are guests. So thank you so much, Auntie Fran. So now, this is the portion we want to go into some questions that we've received from those who are present. This is a question for all of you that came from one of our philanthropists and consultants in the audience. We'd love to hear, because this is a funder briefing, if you're able and comfortable, what does the breakdown of support look like for your organizations? How much support do you feel like you get from foundations, governments, sponsorships? What does that look like? And is that accessible? So we'll start with Auntie Fran, and then we'll go to Patsy and then Lalofi.
Because art is not considered medicine to the rest of the universe, but to Indigenous people, I get pretty much nothing. So it's a fight. I'm constantly fighting, plus our numbers again with that 1%, that's again data that's collected without going through Indigenous practice of data. So even that way of collecting data is just inaccurate. So it's a really hard struggle for us to get any arts, because it's, why is it important? And even with COVID, it was just as tough, because a lot of our artists, again, are a gig community, and they couldn't apply for unemployment. And so I'm constantly trying to find, can you just give me 1,000? Do you have 1,000? It's not for me, it's for them. They can't get it. They're gig, they don't have it, and if we got 100, one of them had to come in and just help me clean the garden. And it was just hard, because people just, again, saw us as leisure and tourist economy versus storytellers and practitioners of medicine and language. And we're totally in alignment with that, but it's not even about this building. It was really about our people. And they can even recognize, the multiplicities of our different artists. They weren't just Chamorro, right? They also had other ethnic, and they were BPIOC, and it was even tougher to even tell that bigger story without having to get a document that says, please just check the box that why you and them. And so that was our biggest struggle. We were on the bottom of that totem pole. So I even asked to buy people, and I said, what do you need? I said, I need to pay the artists. I need someone to pay my artists that are here, just volunteering. I need to pay the gardener, which is usually me. Yeah. I need a new toilet, seriously, but I need the plumber. Yeah, so it was tough, because it's infrastructure, but it's an art organization, so nobody really saw us as being important. So struggle is real over here. Struggle is real.
Thank you for that, Auntie Fran. I'm especially this point that you make, how readily people consume our culture, but are not willing to protect and provide for our culture keepers. And in particular, this piece of how inequitable it can be, the ways that people ask us to demonstrate our significance. Not only inequitable, but oftentimes racist. So thank you for that. Patsy, what about you? What does the support look like for you as far as breaking down, philanthropic contribution, government, earned revenue? What does that look like for SCDC?
Yeah, so SCDC has been really fortunate, but again, it took us a long time to get where we are today. I would say 90% of our funding is from government, from applying for proposals and competing against other folks. But there are some proposals that are specific for Pacific Islanders, so we were able to do that. I would say between 1 and 5% is from donations and private foundations. And again, I think with private foundations, it's really building those relationships with those folks that, you know, if they don't know who you are, and don't know what you do and who you serve, you know, it's a little tough because there's always other folks applying for those. So, but we've been fortunate. But again, it'd be nice to just have like unrestricted money so that the government doesn't dictate what you can and cannot do in serving our population. Because you know, one of the things I've always said was, you know, government entities or city entities sit across the city, and but we're the ones are in the middle of where the services and the needs are for our Samoan Pacific Islander here in San Francisco, in the southeast sector where we're concentrated. So, but we're fortunate, you know, like I said before, whatever is given to us, we're gonna make it work, whatever that may be. But we make it work, and we made it work for 30 years. So we'll just, you know, keep advocating, and hopefully there's many more spaces like this where there are funders and philanthropists that will listen, hear our voices, and you know, hear us say, you know, we're here. We're not going anywhere. So
Thank you so much, Patsy. Lolofi, what about you? What does support for Malo look like?
Right now it's like Patsy saying out of nowhere, but I mean obviously people have been hearing us. Before it was just out of Lolofi's pocket. That wasn't much, so we lived off of blessings. So thank you. I was just grateful for everybody and the blessings our work was getting. So people thought that we were a fully functioning organization with lots and lots of money, but no, it was just the will, our will and our prayers that made it look so $1 million. But really right now, our funding mostly comes from foundation funds. You know, Epic is one of our beginning who saw the potential in us when we weren't sure, you know, that we could do this work. And then right now, because of COVID, we've been getting a lot of support from the Riverside Public Health. And so, you know, for me, it's just thinking, you know, when COVID ends, is this when these funds? So hope for me that, you know, as we're doing this work and we're doing it at, you know, we're trying to do it at a level that just, you know, making a difference in the community, but mainly, again, like Patsy's saying, building these relationships where people see that, you know, we can do this work. It's just a matter of like, you know, how can we get funding to do this work? And then even with the funding, it's, can we get like a commitment of 5 years so we don't have to worry about, you know, the little, you know, writing this $1,000, writing this 500, and just, you know, hoping that it will add up so that we can, you know, one day get our facility that we would love to have to be a support in the community. But yeah, just right now, we've been just getting a lot of love from the foundations locally, and just, you know, building relationships has been what's been working for us. And then for public health, the only reason they even looked our way is we had a meeting with public health, Riverside Public Health, and they saw, once the disaggregating of the data, they saw how it just shifted from this, you know, together it looks like this and we're over here. Once you disaggregate that, we are the number one getting hit, and people are writing about it in articles, but they're overlooked. They continue to just see our big numbers, that we're being the ones impacted the biggest by this COVID, and they just still look over us. So, you know, it's a matter of like, yes, there's data you can look at to try to get funding, but you also have to see that some people, they don't want to see that. So again, I think it goes to the 1%. So it's just, again, just working to get, you know, our voices heard. And, you know, it's unfortunate that I had to say, it doesn't make sense that our community is going to 3 funerals a week during a pandemic. Like there's something wrong, and we need to make sure that we make the communities aware of this, because they're not seeing it in that way.
Thank you for that, Lolofi. I think that's really important. All 3 of you really lift up something really critical, right? Of, you know, the inequitable distribution of dollars, the ways in which our communities have either been seen as not large enough, right? And I think this is also oftentimes like a misinterpretation of equity, right? The notion of equity is that because our community is 0.5% of California, that we only need 0.5% of the dollars. But the reality is that when you are starting from scratch with no infrastructure, right, that it costs more. It costs more. I think the other notion, right, of like, oh, okay, you only account for 0.5%, so how much impact could it be? And what COVID has taught us is that our communities, because we are a smaller population, that we are often the miner's canary of inequity, that things that would be harmful to other communities devastate us, right? And then I think we constantly learn and know time and time again, right, that racism and poverty, it's never a good time to be a poor person of color. And during a pandemic, it will kill you. It will kill our communities. So what I hear also, and want to reiterate so much, just a thank you to you all for your wisdom, for your generosity, for the kindness of letting everyone see you, really see you and your work, and the ways that you are in such servant leadership to our people. I think the other thing, right, so just these points that we want to make sure that philanthropy understands. When we talk about a disaggregation of data, we also mean a disaggregation of resources. How do you all understand and know that dollars that have been marked as API are actually being given to the Pacific Islander communities? These very leaders who have proven for decades, time and time again, that they are the ones that Pacific Islanders are going to go to meet their needs. Dollars and funding that is sustained, that you're not just here in crisis, but you're here before and after that crisis, that we are already preparing, and that we are as a community going to be responding to this pandemic for a decade to come, right? We're not done seeing, right? That one, the pandemic is not over, but two, even when it's declared over, we will continue as a community to feel the effects. And so is philanthropy also here for the long haul, for the long-term investment in our communities and our recovery. So thank you all so much as panelists. At this time, I also want to thank and bring in our closing blessing. So again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to the co-hosts, NeighborWork USA, Advancement Project California, our many co-sponsors, APIs in Philanthropy, Inland Empire Funders Alliance, Asian Pacific Fund, Asian Pacific Community Fund, so many people, and the Asian American Pacific Islander Civic Engagement Fund. Many folks who have believed in EPIC for a really long time and also believed in the need to serve the Pacific Islander community. So for our closing blessing, I want to turn it over to our very gracious Pastor Pasakaya Thompson.
Hi. First of all, thank you, Tavai, for having me on. And before I close us off in a blessing, I just wanted to quickly say and sort of deconstruct the narrative of the churches. I'm here as a pastor, but I also want to say that I think the identity of the pastor in the light of this pandemic, and I think within the last maybe 10 years has changed, as we are also very much wells to drink from when it comes to the community work, and especially in sustaining the families within the Pacific Islander community. And I just want to kind of deconstruct the narrative of where primary funding heads. So usually we're on the receiving end of primary funding going one place, and then we're the ones that sort of provide the agency as to where some of these organizations come to fulfill some of these programs. So I wanted to say, in the light of this conversation, that I do appreciate being invited here to give blessings, and it's how we start and how we end as Pacific people. But I also want to say that the churches are the ones that are also doing an enormous amount of work through the support of Tavaya, also with EPIC. We've been engaged constantly. So that is also a resource for funders to also look to, as you know, especially in the light of what we've experienced in the past 2 years, year and a half, but also right now when we talk about the needs of the community. And with that being said, I will close us off in a Psalm 1 prayer. Le atua mātou te whaaftaia lau fio le nei taimi. O no lo wanga le lei o mātou whaasoa. Nisi foi o i lātou o lo whai mataita i o lo mātou wāwhia ngai le ngata i nei. O nisi foi stete ma me o lo papa awe foi lātou. O alom whanau i o le Pasifika. Sa ili soani e ala le tamau a inga. Ia na ia whatino ai o lātou ngā luenga. Mātou tatalo le atua ia e foa i atu i ate i lātou le malosi. Foa i le poto mo le ata mai. Whatino ai a lātou ngā luenga. Le ngata i lea. Au nai o mātou uso a tangata. E o nai o mātou uso a sia mai lātou. Whai foi i lātou mo taitai. I vaenga ese. Tatalo le atua. Ia mātou langona le ngā lulu e whatasi. Mātou langona le anganga mo le loto e tasi. Ina ia o atu ai le so soani lātou. O lo tangi mai ma mana o mia le atu ai lo wanga le lei. Nei taimi ma le nei aso fuafuanga mga aluenga o lo totoe. A wale itia lava i lau fio mātou tau mo whainga uma. Tālo voi lau fio le atua o avoi ni o mātou se mani o mātou vai vainga. Lofa maia, whamangalo o i mātou lava o nao ni tangata. A ia whai lava o mātou tangata ma au mea whainga aluenga. E ala ile. Ala lofa maleanga le atu i o mātou uso a tangata uma. Le ngata i nei i California ma Amerika. Ai o lava le lalolangi atu. O talo lea e ala atu ia Yesu Keriso. Lo mātou wali i ma lo mātou whaona. Amen.
Amen. Pasakaya lava whaiwhiao, Pasakaya Thompson. Just as a final note, as folks are heading out, I do want to lift up, right, that at the forefront of this is really this conversation about data, about this report that we plan to put out that really illustrates both in numbers and in stories, the needs of our community as well as our resilience. And so what it'll take for that report to come out, for that to happen, is funders like you. And so we will be following up to talk with philanthropy about how they can support these efforts to really, undergird their survival of the Pacific Islander community in California. So thank you so much. Take care, everyone.